Huh? They don't want to be seen as being big on China. Why? Because then it would be like they were against the Axis. Dude, which war have you been following? Huh? Not all of the Axis, only the Japanese, but the Japanese are allied with all of the other Axis. But it's been cool so far, ever since Mongolia a few years ago. What the actual are you talking about? October 22nd, 1943. Defend south of Rome, defend north of Rome, defend south of Rome, defend north of Rome. The argument for the German winter defense of Italy has gone on and on, but this week, they decide. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Allies began a bombing campaign against the Japanese base at Rabaul with a successful action. There was a disastrous Allied bombing raid of Schweinfurt in Germany, though. In Italy, the Allies fought their way across the Volturno River and realized that the fight in Italy is going to be tough. And in the USSR, the Soviets attacked Melitopol in the south and took Zaporozhye further north and were poised to try to break out of multiple bridgeheads on the Dnieper. Something happens in the USSR this week, away from the battlefield actually, that involves the Allied commands. On October 18th, the Third Moscow Conference begins at the Kremlin. British, American, and Soviet foreign ministers Anthony Eden, Cordell Hull, and Vyacheslav Molotov are all there. This is a series of 12 meetings. Jumping ahead to overall conclusions, the USSR will agree to the full creation of a world peace organization with its allies, and on the 30th will sign the Declaration of the Four Nations, with China as the fourth. It is the US that really wants the four-power declaration on wartime cooperation. This involves reiterating the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers and the full establishment of the United Nations, and China being included as a major power. President Roosevelt and Hull are very firm about this. The first of those ideas is accepted by the British and Soviets after some hesitation. But as for the China thing, both say absolutely not. The British just in general, and the Soviets also because they do not want Japan to see them as associated with the Allies in the Pacific War. They will, however, both eventually be brought around to agreement, and the US will be brought around, and it might even be more reluctantly, to at least minimally recognizing the French National Committee of Liberation, Charles de Gaulle's provisional government. They agree that Germany is to be disarmed and denazified, but they do not agree on its future borders, or if it should be broken into pieces, or if and how much reparations should be. They talk about Italy, and that the Soviets will get a representative on the Allied Council that advises the military there. But the Soviets want their share of the Italian fleet that surrendered last month, both of the Navy and the merchant fleet. There will eventually be an agreement whereby the Soviets get British and American shipping equal to what the Soviets request from the Italian fleets. The Americans try to get a talk started about post-war economic relations between everyone, but this is stymied by both the British and the Soviets. They sign the Declaration on Italy, Declaration on Austria, and declarations on atrocities. Together with the Four-Power Declaration, these are the Moscow Declarations. The Italy one is anti-fascism and pro-Italian democracy. The Austrian one voids the Anschluss. This was more an effort to stimulate opposition to the Berlin regime in Austria and in German military formations recruited in Austria than a recognition of the fact that, while included in Germany, many Austrians had come to realize that they were not Germans after all. The atrocities one is mainly drafted by Winston Churchill and is semi-specifically against German atrocities. It says that those who have committed atrocities will be sent to the countries where they did so to stand trial. It also leads to setting up the European Advisory Commission, the 30th, which is to study post-war European politics and make recommendations to the three European allies present. The Americans and Soviets are generally not very enthusiastic about this. All the Allies do promise to tell each other when any of the enemy sends out peace feelers, a point of special significance at a time when satellites of Germany were trying to find a way out of the war without risking the wrath of the Germans, a ridiculous undertaking as the Italian experience might have taught any leader in Helsinki, Budapest, Bucharest, or Sofia with eyes and brains. Already on the 19th, they agree that over the next 8 months, the US will send 2.7 million tons of supplies to the USSR via Soviet Far Eastern ports and 2.4 million more via the Persian Gulf. The Soviets could certainly use that material right now since they are still on the move. On the 17th, they cross the Dnieper south of Gomel, and that same day, break out of the German positions south of Kremenchug. Ivan Konev's steppe front actually launched its attempted breakout from the Dnieper at Mishur Rog at the end of last week. They advanced, and they continue advancing as this week gets going, forcing the front lines back day after day, opening up the gap between German 8th Army's southern flank and 1st Panzer Army's northern one. On the 17th, Erich von Manstein orders the SS Totenkopf Division to try and close the gap. They struggle to get into position to do so over the muddy autumn roads, and they're in a pretty bad state at the moment anyhow, so that's not really gonna happen. On the 18th, the Soviet armored spearheads reach Piatekhatki. Armor Commander Pavel Rutmistrov writes that their arrival is such a surprise that a train loaded with Panther tanks is waiting at the station to unload and falls into their hands. Even more of a bonus for the Soviets than that, though, is that here is the main supply dump for Großdeutschland Division, so they take 220 tons of supplies. Until now, the German units at least had enough ammo for their weakened states, but from now on, that's not going to be the case around here. Now, Rutmistrov's armor has outrun their infantry support, the 37th Army and 7th Guards Army. Georgy Zhukov orders 2 tank corps and some rifle divisions sent up from fronts further south. And to reinforce his bridgehead, Konev has stripped other parts of his lines. 53rd Army is to advance on Kirovograd, so Rutmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army is advancing on Krivoy Rog all on its own with its flanks unprotected. They cover 30 kilometers or so of rough ground over the next few days, and as the week ends, have arrived and prepare to seize it with a quick attack. On the 21st, Nikolai Vatutin's forces to the northwest on the river try again to break out of the Bukrin Bend, but just like last week, they are thwarted after days of trying. But remember, even though they are taking heavy casualties and not taking ground, they are tying down a lot of German forces that could be used to fight breakthroughs elsewhere. On the 18th in the south, the Soviets have reached the center of Melitopol, but fighting for the city continues the rest of the week. Something here of general importance. On the 20th, the 4 Soviet fronts in and around Ukraine are renamed. Voronezh Front becomes 1st Ukrainian, Steppe 2nd Ukrainian, Southwest Front 3rd Ukrainian, and Southern Front 4th Ukrainian. The Dnieper is not the only mighty European river the Allies have fought their way across. They managed to fight their way across the Volturno River in Italy last week, but Allied optimism about that campaign has disappeared. Army Group Commander Harold Alexander cables London the 21st. "We are committed to a long and costly advance to Rome, a slogging match." German High Command has been debating where to hold the line against the Allies. Erwin Rommel, who commands 9 divisions in the north of Italy, wants to retreat to a line all the way up just below the Po River Valley. Smiling Albert Kesselring disagrees with this. See, even though in numbers, it's a relatively minor theater of the war, right? The Germans have 163 divisions on the Eastern Front and 34 in France and the Low Countries, but Italy is the active front where the enemy might be stopped this fall. And what kind of morale hit would it be to lose Rome? And giving the Allies airfields in central Italy to conduct ever more bombing runs on Romanian oil and Austrian targets? Nay, nay, nay. Adolf Hitler apparently is about to name Rommel supreme commander in Italy, but changes his mind and names Kesselring instead. And that means they will defend according to Kesselring's map. The Italian peninsula was narrowest south of Rome, just 85 miles from sea to sea. Across this neck of country so wild it was home to wolves and bears, the Germans could build 3 progressively stout fortified lines, to be named Barbara, Bernhard, and Gustav. The object is to create an impregnable system of positions in depth and so to save German blood. The Gustav Line, anchored on the vertical massif at Monte Cassino, could become the most formidable defense position in Europe, strong enough that the British and Americans would break their teeth on it. The three lines together are the Winter Line. The Barbara Line is strongpoints designed not to stop the enemy, but to delay him while the other lines are completed. It doesn't cross the whole peninsula, but goes from Monte Massico, like a dozen or so kilometers north of Naples, through Teano and Presenzano to the Matese Mountains, which are Italy's spine. 15 kilometers behind Barbara is Bernhardt, which is much stronger and runs from the mouth of the Garigliano River also up to the Matese Mountains. This line also extends to the Adriatic along the Sangro River. In the west of the country, this line is being developed in depth along some really formidable mountain peaks. Of course, the Gustav Line is even more fortified. Okay, in the far west, Gustav and Bernhard are the same line, but a bit inland, Gustav goes 15 or so kilometers to the rear to be anchored on Monte Cassino, an awesome natural fortress. It too heads to the Adriatic, like 30 kilometers or so northwest of the Sangro River. I talked a bit about the roads to Rome last week, and how Highway 6 seems a more likely bet than Highway 7 for the Allies. There is this to consider though. The virtue of Highway 6 to the Allies was that once the road passed Cassino, it led into the wide valley of the Liri River, the gateway to Rome. If the Allies could break into the valley, they could deploy their tanks and dash 80 miles to the city. But to reach the Liri Valley, they would first have to overcome the Barbara Line, run the gauntlet of the Mignano Gap, a narrow corridor dominated by mountains that were incorporated into the Winter Line, and then break through the main Winter Line fortifications at Cassino and along the Rapido River, a natural barrier that ran along the entrance to the Liri Valley. Knowing full well the route the Allies would take, the Germans concentrated their strongest defenses to block it. Kesselring has ordered his men to hold the Barbara Line until at least November 1st, when the defenses behind it would be built. So far, that's what they've done. Well, thanks to ultra-intelligence, the Allies are aware of this. But 7 Allied divisions head back to Britain to start training for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion planned for next spring. So at the moment in Italy, the Allies have 11 divisions total, and the Germans 23. It's not going to be easy. And things are now officially harder as well for the Jews in German-occupied Italy. On the 16th, the SS goes into action, rounding up many of the Jews of Rome who are sent to Auschwitz. There's very interesting background to this and all of those who tried to prevent it, and not just for ideological reasons, and that is covered on our War Against Humanity series, so check that out. It's not, of course, just German resistance that the Allies must overcome. There is also the matter of Japanese resistance. On the 20th, the Australian 24th Infantry Brigade arrives at Finschhafen to help clear out continuing Japanese resistance in the area. The lightning speed of the Allied advance, which had brought them control of the Huon Peninsula and a jumping-off base to invade New Britain, thoroughly alarmed the Japanese command in Rabaul, at the other end of the island. Their garrison on Bougainville, the last of the Solomons, some 300 miles to the southeast, was now all that stood between the main Japanese base in the South Pacific and the other wing of the American advance. Imperial General Headquarters now reversed themselves once more by ordering Imamura to switch all his reserves to holding Bougainville as the final island bastion. They order Commander Miniechi Koga and his combined fleet to help out, but he's already moved the fleet, well, most of it, from Truk to Eniwetok because the American fleet is now attacking Japan's central Pacific Island perimeter. So he sends a lot of his carrier air strength back to Rabaul, which is kind of repeating Yamamoto's earlier mistake of splitting force. This is planes from 6 carriers, and though they will be withdrawn from Rabaul in November, they will by then have taken heavy losses, and Japan is losing experienced pilots at an alarming rate. And here are 2 notes to end the week. On the 17th, the last operational German auxiliary cruiser, Michel, is sunk by a U.S. sub off the coast of Japan. Michel sank 17 ships on her voyage. On the 19th, the German War Office contracts 12,000 V-2 rockets. These are liquid-propelled and are the first long-range for their era, guided ballistic missiles. Following the Allied bombing attack on a rocket production facility at Peenemünde back in August, the German plans for launching the rockets when they have been built have been changed from underground bunkers and fixed launch pads to making mobile launch systems. And the week ends with the Allies crossing two mighty rivers in force, but with millions of the enemy and strong enemy defenses still to overcome, and another Allied conference deciding what they are going to do when they have done so. It's true what I said, right? That at this point, even though it's a smaller front in land and men, Italy is the one active place in Europe where the Allies can conceivably be beaten this fall. I mean, who knows what'll happen in the USSR or the rest of the world in 1944, but here and now, the Germans have the advantage in men in Italy and are building mighty, mighty defenses to hold and perhaps break out from over the winter. And just last week, the Allies were so optimistic there. But it's never that easy. This is modern war. And I will continue to cover this modern war until its conclusion thanks to the Time Ghost Army, which is what finances this series. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Chris Stochai, and these are our newest commissioned officers. And you too can join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And I mentioned the War Against Humanity series earlier. It is a very necessary component of our coverage of this war. And you can check out the War Against Humanity playlist right here. And you can also subscribe, and you can also come back so that I can see you next time.